This is Jeffrey Madoff, and welcome to our podcast called Anything and Everything with my partner, Dan Sullivan.
One of the things that we talked about was games, talking about critical thinking, and we were talking about passion, and we were talking about, is talent the most important thing you need to be a successful entrepreneur? We're going to weave those four subjects together. First, with the games, I'm not big into games where I compete with other people. I'm into games where I compete with myself. And I find the best game that lends itself to playing against yourself is actually life itself. Okay. And what I'm saying is that I'm competing with my previous performance. And I actually have forms and everything that I use every day. I keep score. But I've never enjoyed individual games. I think we had a discussion about this, where it's one person against another person. I've never enjoyed that. I have enjoyed team games where there's a score for the team, but you did want to beat the other team. Yeah, you wanted to win with your team. In other words, you wanted to contribute as much as possible with your team, but you did want to beat the other team.
Well, games to me, when I was a kid, there were marathon games, and those marathon games were like Monopoly, where we'd leave it set up as long as we were playing at Sonny Loudon's house. I don't think you knew Sonny Loudon. And,
yeah.
and as long as his mother didn't come in and say, "You've got to clean off this table," we would leave the board set up with the markers. And it was just a fun way to interact with each other.
Yeah.
When I got into sports, like in wrestling, which was a one-on-one sport, although team numbers would win me, but it was one-on-one.
That was Big Ten too, wasn't it?
Well, in high school, no.
Oh, but in university it was.
In college.
Yeah.
And sports is kind of a different animal than the games. Like I used to play cards. My grandfather taught me. I was very, very close to him. By the time I was 5, I could play poker, pinochle, and gin with the adults.
Wow.
And that was fun. My Uncle Phil, he died owing me $1,800, tried to collect it from his son, but I couldn't get it.
So you got to get it on the day.
I hadn't been that sophisticated in business yet.
Yeah.
But it was fun playing with my Uncle Phil because each hand I would beat him, he would just laugh, thinking, "I don't know how you did that." And he would just laugh. And I said, I'm glad you're enjoying it, Uncle Phil, pay me. But that didn't really happen either. But those kinds of games, I have now zero tolerance for games. It's been true for over 40 years now.
Yeah.
I can't play games anymore. I don't know why. And
it's sort of, if I'm doing this, there's something more important that I'm neglecting if I'm playing the game.
Well, one question that I think is always important to ask yourself if you're doing something and questioning it is, what else could I be doing?
I do that all the time.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Not that I necessarily hate it. I'll still continue to waste time doing whatever I was doing.
Yeah.
But I do hate it sometimes. But what I wonder about games is the cultural aspect of games. What you were saying is basically that you eschewed the competitive aspect of it. And that to me was fun for a while. But I wondered, in games, it's very binary. You win or you lose. And I think that there's so many comparisons, especially, business and sports and all the analogies between the two. And I wonder, how does that affect us when we think of an activity as either a win or a loss? And I wonder if that came from, our sense of play, or did our sense of play come from that idea of winning or losing? And is that necessarily the best way of looking at something?
I haven't done a deep study on it, but I suspect it was connected to warfare for men, that the games that you would play, and it brought out certain skills that were useful for warfare. I just happened to read something about Rome, that there was a while where the gladiators killed each other, but then they ran out of gladiators, so they decided that they would have a less lethal form of the gladiator games. And it was betting. There would be betting on the activities. But the other thing is, I think some people are born with a competitive chip in their brain and other people aren't. I was born with a collaborative chip in my brain. I like collaborating. I just like putting my skill together with someone else's skill and producing something that's bigger than both of us. So since I don't have the inkling, to do, I can't make a judgment about people who love it because I just don't find it attractive. I like creativity and I like collaborative creativity. And there's competitors in creativity that what they create is better than everybody else's creativity, but it's never really interested me.
Well, and there are people, because of their creativity, they've carved out a niche for themselves.
I like having a monopoly, though. I do like having a monopoly.
Well, Monopoly has got to be the ultimate capitalist gameplay for kids, where you develop these properties.
Yeah.
And by the way, Monopoly was created by a woman who never got credit for that. The backstory of Monopoly is kind of.
And I think she was a socialist or something, wasn't she?
I think you're right.
I think there's a backstory. I think she was a Marxist,
Yeah.
But she was short of cash. It always strikes me that people who are against the system then create something that is directly related to the system that they hate. Yeah, it's an interesting thing.
Well, and it's interesting with Monopoly because it's truly an entrepreneurship game.
Yeah.
If you develop the properties and you've developed the right properties and people happen to land on them, you can
make sure it's boardwalk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Baltic, the slums.
Yeah. Don't want to go to Baltic.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I wonder if, in terms of from the time we're kids, we play these games where people win and lose. And like you, I consider myself a collaborator. That's what's really interesting to me, because the effect of that collaboration with the right person, like I'm fortunate enough to have with Sheldon Epps, for instance, the director of personality, is for me much more satisfying.
Me too.
And it's not about being able to exercise my will, but I'm wondering if in our culture, if you don't win, do you lose?
Yeah, occasionally, or is there a thing about always winning? You have to win.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure there is. I mean, I think the culture's got everything in it, and competition is one of it. One of the later topics that we had today was passion. You talked about passion and follow your passion. And we were at a conference where Palmer Luckey is there. Palmer Luckey is an interesting, very, very interesting tech guy. And he's about 30, 31, 32, I think, right now. But when he was 17, he was a gamer. He the online gaming. And he was apparently very good at it, created a lot of games himself. But he created the Oculus goggle, the thing that fits over your face. When he was 17 or 18, I don't think he went to university or anything. I think he just came up, very inventive. And Facebook offered him $2 billion because Mark Zuckerberg is hyper competitive. He paid him $2 billion when he was 20 years old or something for it. But he's not an employee. He's not the sort of, when you buy somebody, then you've turned entrepreneur into an employee. And there was a falling out and he left, but he had his $2 billion. He has $2 billion. And now he's developing weapons for the U.S. government. And he can apparently do it at 1/10 the price, much more effective weapons. And sensors, sonar sensors, land sensors. He actually was developing a sensor for the part of Los Angeles that has the winds, the canyons, where it could sense just a certain temperature of the ground and immediately it would put out a warning. And they wouldn't go for it. They wouldn't go for it. They didn't. He had an early warning system. But, he's just somebody who's going to do well. And he had a reason I'm bringing this up. He said, I'm totally against following your passion. He says, what you do is follow your capabilities. And he says, you develop certain capabilities, and as those capabilities meet certain opportunities, and whatever it does, you follow that. So I thought it was really a line. He said, I just don't believe in this passion thing. But the thing I feel about that is that I just read what you wrote about the passion. And I said, the people I really bet on are the people who cannot not do what they're doing.
Hmm.
So would you say that's passion? There's just something they cannot not do, and they'll do it whether they get paid for it or not. There's a something that they have. And I will always bet on a person who cannot not do the things that contribute to me.
Yeah, I think that, in a sense, you're asking, so what?
I don't know what passion is because how do you experience passion? What's that feel like? Is it emotional? Is it intellectual?
For me, the passion, I recognize passion is when I am completely engaged in what I'm doing. And that engagement has a sense of gratification and fulfillment.
Mhm.
I mean, the fastest way for me to glaze over is, somebody explaining the deal they just did.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah, that's not your passion.
No.
Yeah, but it probably is theirs.
Yeah. Or I think there are people that need a metric
Hmm.
to measure their activity.
Sure,
And
I do. I do.
well, it depends on the metric for me.
Hmm.
So for me is this something I want to be doing? Why am I doing it?
Yeah.
It's not any kind of, crystals and pyramids in terms of following passion. How hard I work to try to do what I'm doing. But the old saying about, but if you really love it, it's not work. I mean, I think that's true for you too.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
It's easier to say it at 80 than when I was 40. I think I'm in a position right now where I'm only doing what I love doing. I don't think I do any other activities besides things that I really love doing. And I've been very strategic about that over the years, making sure it lines up with how I'm best paid. And I think that's what entrepreneurs are. Entrepreneurs who are individuals who have enough self-awareness and enough self-confidence that they can hit the marketplace head on. Very few people can hit the marketplace head on. They need a buffer. They need intermediaries who will guarantee them an income, and it's the intermediary's job to find a usefulness to what you're doing, and you're guaranteed. And I don't need the intermediaries. I can go out and I can just meet people and I can, understand what they're up to. I can understand what they're trying to achieve. And through questioning and giving them a process that I can do it. And I've had, I've been confident about that from a very early age that I can always find a way to make money in a way that suits me.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
We share that.
Yeah.
I have the same. And it's interesting because it goes hand in glove with your concept of there's two sales. And the first sale has to be to yourself.
Yeah, you have to sell. Yeah.
And to me, if you have sold yourself, you're on the passion road.
Yeah.
Because then it's something that you really want to do,
Hmm.
and that you will undertake despite the challenges.
Hmm.
When I was seeing this play, it's actually auditions for my play when we were in London. And this has happened in Chicago, it happened in Pennsylvania, it happened in New York, all the different auditions we held and so on. And I thought about, wow, these people, against all odds, statistically, they are really dealing in lottery world, but they're compelled
Hmm.
to do this.
Hmm.
And I have so much gratitude for the fact that they do, because the joy or thought that their work gets from others.
Hmm.
And I know from like seeing audience responses to personality, one of the reasons I wanted to do a play was, and I didn't know what the story was going to be, and I didn't know I wanted to do a play until I met Lloyd. And then everything changed. That wasn't part of my to-do list.
Yeah.
But it happened. And when I'm asked, which I've been asked many times, oh, is this a passion project or is this a commercial project? And my answer is yes.
Hmm.
It's both. You don't have to choose.
Hmm.
And, money is the fuel that drives things, allows you to drive things forward.
Hmm.
So it's a business.
Mhm.
But am I passionate about what I'm doing? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have never seen an entertainer of any sort, whether it's a dancer, a musician, an actor, or whatever, that I didn't think was, how could I say this? Their passion for what they were doing was clear. And they
Mm.
happened to be at that crossroads. If it's not a product of nepotism, they happen to be at that crossroads where their talent and the application of that gave them the opportunity to bring that to fruition in front of other people that could help finance their efforts
Mhm.
by getting booked. I'm
Yeah.
sure Meryl Streep was not a great business person, but she was a staggering talent who I am sure brought passion to everything she did, or at least
Mhm.
most things she did. And I think that a life without passion isn't a life that is not well lived.
Yeah. One of the things in looking at our topics today, I was saying, it's one of those things that at a certain age, I used to think I understood other people's relationships, why they were, together. And as I go along, more and more, I find I'm more and more ignorant about why two people have a relationship with each other. But the same thing has to do with talent and ambition and opportunity. More and more is I don't know why I've been lucky, and I don't know why my talent lined up with my opportunities, but it did, it did. And I find myself less and less judgmental about people for whom it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't. I said, I don't know. I don't. And I have what I would say, I'm less confident about and saying, well, if you just did this and this and this and this, it would line up because I don't know if it's true for them.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I call the myth of replication. That somehow, if you followed these same 7 steps as if it were a recipe, you would have the same outcome as that person who is, by all accounts, successful at what they're doing. Well, you can't replicate those things.
No.
The whole argument about that is a fool's errand
Yeah.
because you have to understand that you are different than them. The circumstances are different.
Yeah.
The people they met there, all of that type of thing. But I'm curious, when you talk about luck, how do you define being lucky? What is being lucky?
Well, here again, luck is a backward interpretation. So I hadn't really thought about this before. I hadn't really talked about it. But I think a lucky person is someone who can reinterpret any experience that they've had to see where the value of it was for them, whether it was a good experience or a bad experience. And they have a transformational attitude towards their experience where they could have said this didn't happen because of something and it comes out bad. And they say, I've just not been lucky. But I think that's a fundamental attitude. You know, I think it goes very deep. I think it goes right to the center of who you are as a person. For example, we didn't have money growing up. We had enough, but we didn't have anything extra growing up. And so if you wanted money, you had to go out and find a way of getting the money. You had to do something and get paid for it. And I had that very early. I had that very early. As a child growing up, I knew how to see where I could be useful, and then possibly I could get paid for being useful. And I was on the lookout for that. I was on the lookout for where I could do. So I've always had the ability to have money. So is that luck, or was there something that I just observed that if you want money, you have to do something valuable to someone else before you get money? And other people, I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday that 23% of the graduating class of Harvard Business School in June 2024 don't have jobs. They don't have jobs. I was sitting there saying, well, did you think that getting a degree from Harvard got you a job? I mean,
Yes, that's yes, by the way.
yes, they did. Yes, they
Yeah,
did.
that's right.
Yes, they
That's
did.
right.
And I said, well, then, but what they find, that, what was his name? Ross Perot, who got Clinton elected twice in the 90s. And he graduated from Yale Business School. And he went there and He said, I just want to congratulate all the A students, whatever degree they have. Would you have all the A students please stand up? And they all stood up. And he says, let's give him a hand. He says, okay, now I want all the C students to stand up. And they all stood up. And he says, A students, I want you to turn around and look at your future employers. He says, because what I've observed that A students are trying to get really good grades because they think really good grades get them where they want to go. C students want the business models. So they do the minimum to get a grade because they've already started businesses and they just want to see if is there anything there that can actually help you run a business. And he says very seldom do the A students. The A students go, they work at investment banks or they do this. He says the C students are just finding the bare minimum of time to actually get their degree because they're already running businesses, you know. And so, you know, you used the word in your fourth one on talent. You used the two words. You used perseverance and resilience. And then I was saying, yeah, there is enormous perseverance and there is enormous resilience. If I look back, I've been very, very persevering, but only with things that I turned out to be really good with. So is it the talent that gives you the confidence to persevere?
I don't think so.
No.
I think it's a mindset that gets you to persevere because,
I mean, there's obviously lots of people who persevered with something that didn't get them anywhere.
that's right. And that's why I'm saying that I think perseverance is a mindset. It's not a
It's a separate capability.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a separate trait, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, to the ability to persevere and to, you know, the resilience to bounce back from difficult situations.
Yeah.
You know, I think that, I mean,
I think we both have that too. I think
yes.
we're talking about that. I mean, I went 10 years with creating the coaching company before I was breaking even.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I went through two bankruptcies. I went through a divorce and everything else. And I remember talking to a banker. I had a line of credit, which I had to go in and tell him I couldn't pay it back. And he was a nice man. You know, he wasn't mean with me. And he said, you know, when we first talked, he said, you know, you can be employed as a writer, you can be employed as a layout artist and everything else. He says, so when are you going to give up this nonsense of trying to do this new thing? I said, there will be no going back. I said, I'm just not smart enough yet to know how to do this, but I'm going to be smart enough in the future, so I have to do it. And I said, thanks for your help. I'm sorry it didn't work out, but there's no going back. You know, and then within about 2 months, I met Babs, and Babs was really crucial to me having a front stage and a back. I was just all front stage and forgot about the backstage, and she really knew backstage. And then went up and everything else. But I would never, once I'm locked on, there's no going back.
Well, see, I think when somebody says to you, when are you going to stop doing this nonsense?
Nonsense, yeah.
Yeah, that tells you more about them than it does about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and oftentimes what I think the resonating point is that you're somebody who's going for something. You're motivated, passionate, you're going for something. He's not. And any time you meet someone such as yourself, it becomes a reminder that he never took the risks, he never took the chances.
Mm-hmm.
And I really believe that because so many times what people say isn't a keen observation into you. It's a window into them and what their issues are. So why would you say that to somebody? Why would you demean what someone else's efforts are? When are you going to quit this nonsense and do what? Do what you're doing? You know, I mean, what am I giving it up for?
You know, I didn't think of that at the time. You know, I didn't check in to see if there was, you know, the possibility I could become a banker.
Yes,
Yeah.
you hadn't deposited those thoughts.
You know, part of it is that you take your vision seriously, but you don't take yourself that seriously. And what I mean by this is that there's 8-9 billion people on the planet. If this particular one fails, it's not threatening humanity's future. But the one thing I found, especially when I had the double day of a divorce and a bankruptcy, I actually felt kind of freed up. And one of the reasons is that people leave you alone when you're both divorced and bankruptcy. You know, they said, Dan, we're having a little party get together for the occasion and wondered if you could just come over for a couple hours and just tell us about your divorce and bankruptcy. They don't do that. They leave you alone. They give you your privacy and everything else. But I had about 3 months after that, and that happened in August. So it was, about 3 or 4 months. And I just said, you're completely freed up from everybody else's expectations with this. And now the question is, what do you really want? What do you really want? And that's a turning point in my life. That was 1978, 78. And that was a complete turning point in my life. I said, just keep doing what you're doing, get smarter at it, get better at it, and that's it. So I think there's something about a passionate person or the driven person. They're not doing it for status. They're doing it to develop a particular capability that if they're really good at it, they can get really unusually paid for it
Yeah.
if they can pull it off.
And I think,
The biggest risk is that you're risking yourself. Yeah. In other words, you're kind of putting your life on the table and say, I'm just going to risk my entire life
yeah,
to pull this off.
yeah. But, when you can't imagine, as you're saying, can't imagine yourself doing anything different,
Yeah.
and that you're not dissuaded when someone in an authority position tells you, when are you going to give up this nonsense?
Yeah.
At a certain point, there's some people that find that they were delusional, and maybe that person was right.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that's where perseverance comes in. And I think I didn't quite get the definition from you of what you think luck is.
Well, so, the thinking tool that I created for Strategic Coach, it just said that one of the things I've noticed among entrepreneurs when they become really successful, not all of them, but some of them, is that I did it all on my own. It was me that got me where I am. And I said, 50-50. It was you that got to but if you had been born in Ukraine near the front lines, not so lucky. So, one of the things I said, I put down on my sheet, I was born healthy and fit. I've always been healthy and fit and smart enough to succeed. Whatever I was up against, I was smart enough to succeed in that situation. I think that's lucky. You can be born not fit and healthy, and you can not be born with enough brain power to succeed. I was the fifth child in a big family, but I have big age gaps, 6 years one way, 7 years another way, and there's just me. And I just had my parents to myself for almost all my life, and both of them were fifth children. My dad was a fifth child in big family, my mother. And it was like we knew the rules, we understood each other. I consider that very, very lucky. And, meeting Babs was very lucky, all the really great creative partnerships and relationships I've had. I consider that really, really lucky, And what I'm saying is that, when you're born, you realize fairly quickly that nothing that's here was actually created with you in mind.
Right.
You have to come to grips. You have to adjust. You have to negotiate with reality when you're here. And so, I'm answering your question. I'm attempting to answer your question here is that there's things that you can be grateful for,
Mm-hmm.
And so I choose to say those weren't as a result entirely of my own efforts, that the good things that happened to me, they came along and, it happened. You met right people at the right place at the right time. I don't think that's necessarily your capability that does that.
Right. Well, I think, though, close to or adjacent to luck is opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that an opportunity is only an opportunity if you recognize it as such.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it passes you by.
Yeah. And I think that preparation has a lot to do with that, that you were able to see the opportunity because you were prepared. You had prepared your mind, Let's just take personality, for example. You met Lloyd because there was a documentary filmmaker. Who identified Lloyd for you?
A guy by the name of John Bonanni, and John was the executive producer at Radio City, and he hired me to create the 75th anniversary film for Radio City Music Hall. And we became friends, and he was friends with Lloyd. They went to the same eye doctor, so they were in the waiting room at the same time, and he called me from there, and that's how contact started.
Yeah. Now, I think there's luck involved in that.
And not immediately. I mean, I recognize there's the opportunity to do a documentary about him.
Yeah. And then when you did the documentary, you kind of saw the opportunity to take it further.
Yes. Yeah. And it's funny because...
And it was definitely good luck for Lloyd. It wouldn't have happened.
No, I think that's right, because it hadn't happened and hadn't even been close to happening.
Yeah.
So, I think that you're right. But, it's interesting. There's luck, there's opportunity. There's, when those two meet in a certain way, it's serendipity. And I think that going back to where we started in terms of passion, do you think a few years ago, I'm not talking about in your first 10, well, whenever, I guess, in your history, would you have defined your attitude, if you will, towards Strategic Coach and the creation of it? Would you have said that was just a keen business proposition that you knew would turn out well? Or was it the foundation, a passion you had for the kind of interaction and the way that you could think about what you were doing? Where'd that come from?
Definitely the latter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, and it comes from my childhood of just being interested in adults. Mm-hmm. When I'm 8, I'm asking 78-year-olds, what was going on in your life when you were 8 years old, because that's totally passion. I have a passion in understanding other people's stories.
Mm-hmm.
I have a total passion for understanding. And, it did take me 2 or 3 decades to get a business model for that passion.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's, the issue for a lot of people, I think it's twofold. One is recognizing what it is that makes them feel the best about themselves.
Yeah.
And I think doing what you do at Coach not only makes your clients feel better, I think it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
In terms of what you do, and you're in the position that you get to do that all the time.
Yeah. And get well paid for it.
Yes. And I think that, that's something that we both have. And could I have done other things? I mean, I believe there's a number of other things I could have done quite well. I have the capabilities of doing things well like that. It's just I didn't want to do any of those other things.
Yeah.
Because what was missing was I wasn't passionate about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't agree with, the naysaying about follow your passion, because I think, throughout history, those that have excelled have had a passion that they were following. What great artist, what great writer, what great politician, what great anybody got to the fact that we know who they are, but they were just emotionally neutral. Nobody. So I think it's important to examine what we even mean by those words before we can reach a conclusion about where that person is at.
Do you think there's a place in this for it's sort of like getting the right hand dealt to you? For example, I know people who are just sort of scattered. Mm-hmm. They're just sort of scattered. And the nature of their scattering is that they can't focus on the thing. That means they don't have a central thing that they cannot not do. Do you think that's possible? It's just a bad hand.
I don't know if it's a bad hand. I think there can be a few reasons why that happens. And I think that one of the reasons why that happens can be a fear of commitment to something. Because if that something doesn't work out, then in your mind, you are a failure.
Yeah.
As opposed to looking at it positively, well, you tried something, you learned something, you've moved on from there.
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of times when people are that scattered, even with serial entrepreneurs, I think that it's not necessarily, maybe their passion is in starting things, then they lose interest.
Hmm.
But it's also, I think, not committing to something.
Yeah.
I think commitment is really an important part. As long as you're committed to something, in terms of you were committed to building coach and doing that. And when you say the hand you were dealt a lot of hands over those 20 or 30 years until you figured out the business model.
Hmm.
So it's not like it happened instantaneously and batteries included. You had to discover that about yourself, as I think we all do.
Hmm.
And I do believe, I think, that there are people that, at least it seems to be, they were born to do X.
Hmm.
Whether that's a prodigy in music, and that's the case where the capability drives it. But sometimes people find out later in life, I wasn't doing that for me. I was doing it for my parents, and they're living through that. And I don't want to do that. There's no one reason.
Hmm.
And I think what's fascinating is the fact there is no one reason, and
Hmm.
discovering who that other person is and who you are.
Hmm.
The process is, what to me is so fascinating.
Hmm.
Everybody's kind of a riddle, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. It's really interesting to me that my father was an entrepreneur. He was a farmer first and he failed, and then he became a landscaper and he succeeded. Okay. But I'm of the seven children, I'm the only entrepreneur. And I've talked to some of my siblings about that, that dad couldn't do this and dad couldn't do this and dad couldn't do this. And what I saw is dad had great freedom. He had great freedom. What I was picking up on is that for the longest time, there was no security, but there was enormous freedom that he could have. So I picked up on freedom and they picked up on lack of security. That's what they.
Right. Well, that's the old me and Bobby McGee song, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, and that wasn't a direct quote, but I screwed it up a little bit. But
Yeah.
I think that that's true. But it's also interesting. So you have how many siblings?
Six.
And of those six siblings, since what you do is so otherworldly different than what they do, how curious are they about how you've done what you've done?
I didn't hang around with them. The older ones were older and the younger ones were younger. So I basically hunt around with adults.
Uh-huh.
But the other thing is there's the family you're born into is a bit of a roll of dice. The family you develop in the course of your life is by design. And so the other thing is that I have the opportunity to finance their grandchildren. So I've financed about 13 or 14 of them, where I've paid for half their tuition going through university. And they appreciate Uncle Dan. They like Uncle Dan, Uncle Dan's a good guy, and everything like that. So it doesn't, but the thing was I really appreciated my invisibility as a kid. I could do things, go places and do things as long as there was a set of rules I had to follow, and that was not onerous and everything like that. So I'm interested in them. Like when we talk, I find out about their life, but it's not reciprocal.
Well, I think that lack of curiosity,
Yeah.
says something.
Hmm.
And, one could get different messages.
I'm not the only thing they're not curious about. Yeah.
Did you see this Encyclopedia Britannica?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
interested.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. And just as we get close to the end here, the critical thinking one was an interesting question that you asked about critical. How do you know what you know, and why do you believe what you believe? I think it's all being aware of experience and what is the experience. For me, it's what is my experiencing tells me that works and that doesn't work. And that's how I think I've developed my critical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could do a whole segment on that, because I think it's something that's sorely lacking in terms of the teaching of critical thinking. And why is that important?
Yeah.
Because I am always very interested in, why do people believe what they believe, and why do you believe that? You know, which goes along with the thinking about thinking that you're so fond of. And I think critical thinking, which also requires something else that we both believe strongly in, is context. And I find it interesting, especially in the times that we're in now, but I think it's always been really important. But one of the things that I loved about my major, I had a double major in philosophy and psychology. And the thing about philosophy was, it was all about critical thinking. You know, what kind of an argument, what kind of logic, and what kind of an argument could you construct? And God, I was looking back through, I had saved some of my college papers, and Margaret found one of the blue books from a final in symbolic logic. And there were like these 15-page equations that, wherever my brain was at that point in my life, it's not there anymore. And I was like looking at hieroglyphics, at this point. It's like, wow, I actually knew that stuff, and I think that's one of those things. It's funny. It's like my kids learned a totally different math, or learned math in a totally different way than I did. And by the time they were in fifth grade,
you weren't any help.
None. That's right. I didn't even recognize it as math,
Yeah.
Well, if Johnny has 5 apples and Jimmy has 2 apples, and he takes 2, that was how it was when I was growing up.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to learn how to make change. That's the most important lesson.
Yeah, or just take credit cards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's something I feel is very strong in my thinking, that you need to know how you think about things, because you want to attract like-minded people. Yeah. And that's become more and more restrictive as I've gotten older, because I find that I'm looking for people who are entrepreneurial thinkers. More and more and more, that people who realize that if you want something, it requires a commitment, it requires courage. You have to go through long period of courage, short period of courage. It goes through courage. And the big thing is the acquisition of new capabilities. I'm really passionate that you create your future through the acquisition of new capabilities. So I look for people who have that mindset, don't have other reasons why things happen. I think that's my sense. And I'm sure there's other reasons why it works. I'm just only interested in linking up with people who have that attitude.
For me, there's a few tenets to it. If you are curious, if you are intelligent, if you are empathic, and if you have a sense of humor, we're going to get along.
Yeah.
We can differ in any of those areas. But if those 4 character traits, if any one of them is missing, pretty good chance our relationship
It's a filter.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, because I think it's not that I want to attract like-minded people. It's that I am attracted to people who seem alive and engaged and interested.
Yeah.
And that's the thing to me.
Yeah.
And
I'm attracted to people who find me interesting. Yeah, that goes way back. Yeah. Coming up on 81. Yeah. But I think it's very, very interesting to know these things. I think critical thinking for me is that you're aware of how your brain works. And I think that's very, very important, that you be aware of how your brain works. Even the biases that you have, why you have the biases, I think that's very, very important.
Yeah. And that you're curious, or at least I'm curious, about how other people's brains work.
Yeah.
Why do they believe that?
Yeah. They don't work the way mine does.
Yeah.
No, and that's important. That's important.
I think so.
Yeah. So what did we get out of this? I found the four of them that you gave me were really interesting, but I thought that they were interesting together.
Hmm.
But I do know that based on our conveying our different histories to each other, we've done a lot of experimenting on this. How do you size up other people? I mean, I think that we're both deeply interested in how is it, because you have to guess and bet with new relationships.
Hmm.
You have to bet. And how exactly are you becoming a better guesser and a better better? That's an interesting topic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, which, is about being present in the sense of listening to the other people that are around
Hmm.
and getting a sense of, who they are. I mean, there's some people that have the capability of engaging people right off the bat.
Hmm.
There's other people that are more observational and they don't put themselves out there until they feel safe,
Hmm.
to do that. As I get older, realizing I have less time, I don't want to waste time with people that
Yeah.
that we're going to discover, we don't really have anything in common anyhow.
Yeah.
You know, and I can also embrace people that there are things that we disagree, but that's fine.
Hmm.
And those reasons, the reasons for disagreement are understandable,
Hmm.
you know. And I think that too often, because of how isolated people are, that shuts off. It's just all silos. And I mean, I was a pretty popular kid in junior high and high school, but I was never, and there was a pretty cliquish school I went to, but I was never a member of a clique. I had friends, diverse friends throughout,
Hmm.
and was never part of a clique
Hmm.
because I never saw any reason to. Why would I want to just know one type of person?
Yeah, that would be true. That'd be
So,
true with me too. I mean,
well, it's not as much fun.
well, it's the Groucho Marx thing.
Right. About the club.
Yeah, I'd never be a member of a club that would have me as a member.
Yes. I love that.
Yeah,
I love that quote.
that's the story of the man who's marooned on an island. He's Jewish, and he's very handy. So it's 20 years that go by, and boats come by, but a boat sees something. There's a reflection or something, and they come ashore, and he's built an entire town inside the jungle. It's got stores, it's got restaurants, it's got a dry cleaner, but down at the end, there are these two really, really interesting buildings. And he says, what are those two buildings? He says, they're synagogues. He says, synagogues? Well, why do you have two? And he says, well, that's the synagogue I go to. That's the one I wouldn't be caught dead in. I mean, if you're going to bring the culture forward, bring the whole culture. Yeah. But it's interesting. And, the section I just wrote on humanizing the exceptional, I make the point that the more things become technologized, the less interesting the humans are. And that's why you need theater as a transformative quality, is because it makes human beings interesting.
Yeah, and people that take a chance.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
that put themselves out there. People that don't, you know, in one of our past conversations, somebody told me, somebody thanked you for being vulnerable. And you said, you mean being honest?
Yeah. Telling the truth.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that there are many people that consider that to be
Yeah.
that truth and vulnerability, because vulnerability means you can get hurt in some way. And on one hand, you can be hurt by being honest and how people may respond to you.
Mm-hmm.
But, my feeling is, and I'm not talking about life and death situations, my feeling is that you might as well find out whether you're going to get along sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm.
I think, because then you either have more time to develop a relationship and you've made space because you've filtered out the people that it would never work out with anyhow.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, always fascinating where these things go.
Thanks for joining us today on our show, Anything and Everything. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. For more about me and my work, visit acreativecareer.com and madoffproductions.com. To learn more about Dan and Strategic Coach, visit strategiccoach.com.